When fate rolls the dice, logic is powerless. One night, one look, and a silence screaming louder than war. A story where hatred turns to fragile glass, and in an enemy's eyes, you suddenly find home. The rain did not simply fall upon the castle that evening. It besieged it. It was a relentless, drumming assault against the high, arched windows of the library, a rhythm that usually soothed Hermione Granger's frantic mind. But tonight, the sound felt less like a lullaby and more like a ticking clock. She sat surrounded by towers of books, a fortress of parchment and leather designed to keep the world at bay. The 8th year was supposed to be a time of healing, of academic closure, but for Hermione, it felt like walking across a frozen lake where the ice was dangerously thin. If she stopped moving, if she stopped studying, she might fall through into the dark waters of memory. Hermione Granger. The voice sliced through the silence of the library, vibrant and undeniably alive. Hermione didn't startle. She had heard the distinct, energetic footsteps approaching for the last minute. But she did sigh, marking her page in advanced arithmetic theory with a slip of velvet. She looked up to find Ginny Weasley leaning against the end of the stack, her arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips that was entirely too reminiscent of Fred and George. "You have exactly 10 minutes to pack up," Ginny announced, her tone brooking no argument. "I have an essay due for Professor Vector on Tuesday," Hermione countered, her fingers brushing the spine of her book, grounding herself. "And the NEWT revisions are—" "The NEWTs are months away," Ginny interrupted, pushing off the shelf and striding over to pull the chair opposite Hermione out with a scrape of wood against stone. "And you are turning into a ghost. A very well-read, highly intelligent ghost, but a ghost nonetheless. You're coming with me." Hermione rubbed her temples. "To where? If this is another Gryffindor party in the common room with lukewarm butterbeer and exploding snap, I politely decline." "It's not a party," Ginny said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's a gathering, neutral ground, room of requirement. Blaze and I set it up. We're calling it Inter-House Unity Night, but mostly it's board games, wine, and an attempt to stop everyone from hexing each other in the corridors." Hermione raised an eyebrow. "Board games? Magical ones?" "Obviously. And wine," Ginny reiterated, knowing her audience. "Come on, Hermione. Frame it as research if you must. An analysis of post-war social reintegration among former combatants." "Just, please, I need my best friend there. If I'm left alone with the Slytherins, I might accidentally set someone on fire." Social reintegration. The phrase hooked into Hermione's logical brain. She had been worrying about the fractured state of the student body. The polite nods that didn't reach eyes, the silences in the Great Hall. Perhaps observing it in a controlled environment would be beneficial. "Fine," Hermione conceded, closing her book with a definitive snap. "But strictly for observation. 1 hour." The corridors were drafty, the stone floors exhaling the chill of the Scottish autumn. As they walked toward the 7th floor, the castle felt vast and empty, shadows stretching long in the flickering torchlight. Ginny chattered about Quidditch tactics, filling the silence, but Hermione felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. She wasn't ready for noise. She wasn't ready for people. When they reached the stretch of blank wall opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy, a polished mahogany door materialized from the stone, the brass handle glowing warmly. Ginny pushed it open, and the scent hit Hermione first. A rich, enveloping mixture of cedarwood, burning applewood, and something sharp and clean, like ozone. The room of requirement had outdone itself. It wasn't a classroom or a training hall. It was a lounge, intimate and shadowed, lit by dozens of floating candles that drifted lazily near the ceiling like captured stars. Thick velvet armchairs in deep greens and burgundies were arranged in a loose circle around a low, expansive table. A fire crackled happily in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the Persian rugs. It was beautiful. It was cozy. And it was occupied by the last person Hermione wanted to see. Draco Malfoy sat in a high-backed leather chair near the fire, looking for all the world like a brooding prince in a tragic painting. He was dressed in black, impeccably tailored trousers, and a fine wool sweater that emphasized the sharp lines of his shoulders. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, his long, pale fingers resting idly against the glass. He wasn't looking at the fire, though. He was looking at the door. As Hermione stepped over the threshold, her eyes locked with his. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to tilt. There was no sneer on his face, no customary twist of malice. His expression was a smooth, impenetrable mask of boredom, but his eyes, grey as the storm clouds battering the castle, were sharp, assessing. He looked tired, not sleepy, but weary in a way that went down to the bone. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, a tension in his jaw that suggested he was grinding his teeth. "Granger," he drawled. The voice was low, smooth, devoid of the venom she had spent 7 years dodging. It was simply an acknowledgement of presence, cold and factual. "Malfoy," she replied, her own voice steady, though her pulse gave a treacherous little jump. "Glad you could join the festivities," Zabini said from the sofa, where he was shuffling a deck of cards that sparked with blue light. "We were worried the library had finally swallowed you whole." "It was a near thing," Hermione said, moving further into the room. She felt stiff, hyper-aware of her movements. She chose a chair as far from Malfoy as the circle allowed, pulling her cardigan tighter around herself. "Right then," Ginny clapped her hands, dispelling the sudden heaviness in the air. "The game tonight is The Gambler's Grin. It's an old family favourite. Or, well, it's a favourite of Fred and George's, which usually means it's dangerous, humiliating, or both." Hermione watched Malfoy across the low table. He took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames now. He looked utterly out of place among the scatter of cushions and the warmth of the room, like a jagged shard of ice that refused to melt. Why was he here? He looked like he would rather be in Azkaban than playing a Weasley board game. "Why are you here, Malfoy?" The question slipped out before she could check it. It wasn't said unkindly, just with genuine confusion. Draco's eyes flicked back to her. He swirled the liquid in his glass. "Zabini is persistent," he said, his voice flat. "And apparently my probation requires evidence of inter-house cooperation. Consider this me, cooperating." He gestured vaguely with the glass, a motion that was elegant and dismissive all at once. "How noble of you," Hermione murmured. "I try," he deadpanned. There was a tension between them, a taut wire stretched across the table. It wasn't the fiery hatred of their youth. It was something else. Awkward, jagged. They were two soldiers from opposing sides, who had survived the war only to find themselves sitting in a parlour, unsure of the rules of engagement. Ginny placed a large, ornate wooden box on the table. It hummed slightly, vibrating against the wood. "The rules are simple," Ginny explained, opening the box to reveal a board that shifted and changed like a living map and a set of dice carved from bone. "You roll, you move. The board gives you a prompt. It could be a question, a challenge, or a dare. You refuse, you drink the penalty potion." She pointed to a flask of ominously bubbling purple liquid. "Trust me, you don't want to drink it. Last time Ron did, he spoke in limericks for 3 days." Malfoy looked at the board with distinct distaste. "Charming. And if we win?" "Then you get the satisfaction of not being humiliated," Ginny grinned. "And the winner gets to assign the final penalty to the loser." Hermione saw a flicker of something in Malfoy's eyes, a competitive spark. He was arrogant, yes, but he also hated to lose. It was the first sign of life she'd seen in him all evening. "Fine," Malfoy said, sitting up straighter, setting his glass down. "Let's get this over with. I have a staring contest with a wall to get back to." Hermione found herself leaning forward, her earlier reluctance fading into a distinct curiosity. She watched his hands, pale, steady, aristocratic, as he reached for the dice. There was a grace to him, a trained elegance that even his evident misery couldn't suppress. She told herself she was analysing him, just looking for cracks in the armour, signs of the old prejudice. But as the firelight caught the silver of his signet ring, she felt a strange shiver that had nothing to do with the draught in the corridor. The air in the room thickened, charged with magic and the unspoken history between them. Outside, the thunder rolled, a deep, guttural growl that shook the window panes. Inside, the first die was cast, tumbling across the enchanted board with a sound like dry bones rattling. Draco Malfoy watched the die spin, his expression unreadable, but Hermione caught the slight tightening of his lips. He was bracing himself, and for the first time in years, she wasn't looking at him with hatred. She was looking at him with anticipation. The game had begun. The enchanted die tumbled across the mahogany table, a flash of bone white against the dark wood. It spun with a chaotic, clattering energy that seemed to mock the solemnity of the room, bouncing off the rim of a crystal goblet before coming to a jarring halt directly in front of Draco. It wasn't a number. The face of the die displayed a small, leering skull with crossed wands. A low, melodic chime resonated from the board game, the gambler's grin, which lay spread out like a living map between them. The board's surface, a swirling nebula of ink and parchment, shifted. The path Draco's piece, a miniature silver serpent, was travelling on, suddenly spiked with animated thorns. "Ah," Blaise Zabini murmured, leaning back into the velvet cushions with a glass of fire whiskey balanced on his knee. The jinxed roll. Statistically improbable on the first turn, Draco. You truly are a marvel. Draco stared at the die. His expression was one of profound, weary resignation, the kind of look one might give a roof that had started leaking for the 5th time in a week. "Improbable is my middle name these days," he drawled, his voice dry. Ginny grinned, picking up a card that had materialized from the center of the board in a puff of purple smoke. She cleared her throat theatrically. "The board has spoken. Your dare, Malfoy, is categorized under performance and humility." She paused for effect. "You must recite the Ballad of the Barn Owl, in the voice of a love-struck troll. If you fail to capture the emotional depth, you drink the penalty potion. Hermione watched him, expecting the explosion. She expected the sneer, the sharp retort, the storming out. The Draco Malfoy she knew, the boy who had bullied her for her teeth, her hair, her blood, would never debase himself for a parlor game. But Draco didn't storm out. He closed his eyes for a brief second, his long, pale lashes casting shadows on his cheeks, a muscle feathered in his jaw. A love-struck troll, he repeated, the words flat. With emotional depth, Ginny added helpfully. Slowly, painfully, Draco set his drink down. The firelight licked at the sharp angles of his face, illuminating the tension in his shoulders. He looked like a king being asked to juggle for the court's amusement. But then he exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of his family's ruined reputation. He began. It was grotesque. It was guttural. He dropped his voice to a rough, gravelly bass, distorting his refined accent into a brutish, lumbering cadence. He grunted the rhyming couplets about mice and moonbeams, his hands twitching at his sides, as if fighting the urge to hex the board into kindling. Oh, moon so round, like big rockstone, me hearted crush, me sit alone. The room was silent for a heartbeat, and then Ginny burst into laughter. It wasn't cruel laughter, Hermione realized with a start. It was genuine, delighted amusement. Blaise chuckled, shaking his head. Hermione didn't laugh. She sat frozen, her fingers gripping the stem of her wineglass. She was watching Draco's eyes. They were fixed on a knot in the wood of the table, wide and humiliated, burning with a cold fire. He was enduring this. He was letting them laugh because the alternative, being the outcast, the spoilsport, the Death Eater who couldn't take a joke, was worse. When he finished, silence hung heavy in the air, thick with the scent of burning logs and awkwardness. Adequate, the board boomed in a deep, disembodied voice. The silver serpent piece moved forward 2 spaces, only to slide immediately down a chute labelled Bad Karma. Draco slumped back into his chair, reaching for his drink with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. He took a large swallow, the amber liquid disappearing quickly. "Your turn, Granger," he said, not looking at her. His voice was hoarse. Hermione rolled. A 6. Her piece, a small golden book, glided effortlessly up a ladder. She drew a card. Name 3 uses of dragon's blood. Easy. She answered automatically, her eyes still on Draco. The game continued, and the atmosphere in the room of requirement grew thicker, warmer, and stranger. The rain battered the windows with increasing fury, sealing them into this bubble of golden light and magic. But inside the circle, a pattern emerged that defied all laws of probability. Draco could not win. It was as if the universe, having spared him from Azkaban, had decided to extract its price in petty humiliations. Round 3, he rolled a 2. The board turned his hair a vibrant, shocking electric blue. He sat there, looking like a depressed exotic bird, while Blaise offered him a conjured mirror. Draco pushed it away without a word, his face pale beneath the neon hair. Round 4. He landed on a silence square, but drew a charade's dare. He had to act out a hippogriff with an itch without making a sound. Hermione found herself leaning forward, drawn in against her will. She had come here to analyze social dynamics, to document the friction between the houses. Instead, She was witnessing the slow, systematic dismantling of Draco Malfoy's ego. And yet, there was a strange grace to it. He stood in the center of the rug to perform the charade. He was tall, his limbs long and elegant despite the ridiculous task. He moved with a fluidity that he couldn't quite suppress. When he mimed the scratching of a talon, there was a sharpness to the movement, a precise control of his body that fascinated her. He wasn't clowning. He was performing with a grim, silent intensity, determined to complete the task perfectly so he could sit back down. He looked ridiculous. He looked beautiful. The thought hit Hermione like a bludger. She nearly dropped her glass. Beautiful? Draco Malfoy? With blue hair and a scowl that could curdle milk? She shook her head, taking a hasty sip of wine. It was the atmosphere, she told herself. The candlelight softened his sharp features. The blue hair was distracted from the dark circles under his eyes. He sat down after the charade, adjusting his cuffs. He looked exhausted. The mask of indifference was slipping, revealing a raw, bruised frustration underneath. "I hate this game," he muttered to his glass. "It's a game of chance, Draco," Blaise teased. "It's a game of malice," Draco corrected, his eyes flashing. "It's sentient and it's vindictive." "Maybe it just senses your inner turmoil," Ginny suggested, rolling the dice. "Or maybe you just have terrible luck." "My luck ran out 3 years ago," he said quietly. The words were soft, barely audible over the crackling fire, but they landed in the center of the group like a stone in a pond. The laughter died down instantly. Hermione looked at him sharply. He wasn't looking for pity. He was staring into the fire, his expression distant, lost in some private darkness that the game couldn't touch. For the first time, Hermione felt a pang of something that wasn't suspicion. It was a dull ache in her chest, a resonance. She knew that look. She had seen it in the mirror when the nightmares woke her at 3 a.m. It was the look of someone who was waiting for the other shoe to drop, even when the war was over. "Your role, Malfoy," Hermione said softly, breaking the silence. She didn't make her voice sharp. It was a prompt, a lifeline to pull him back from wherever he had gone. He blinked, refocusing on her. His grey eyes met hers, and for a second the hostility was gone, replaced by a confused curiosity. He seemed surprised that she hadn't mocked him. He reached for the dice. "Come on," he whispered to the bone cubes. "Just one decent roll." He threw them. They bounced, they spun. One die stopped on a 5. The other wobbled, teetered, and fell on a 1. The board rumbled. The floor beneath them vibrated. "Oh, that doesn't sound good," Ginny said, eyeing the board. A black card rose from the deck, smoke curling around it in the shape of a skull. The board spoke, its voice deeper this time, vibrating through the soles of their shoes. "The path of truth or treachery. The player has been judged. Resistant. A penalty of vulnerability is required." Draco paled. Vulnerability. What in Salazar's name does that mean? The card flipped over. It didn't have a riddle. It didn't have a spell. It had a simple instruction written in shimmering blood-red ink. The player must maintain eye contact with the person across from them for 2 full minutes. If the player looks away, blinks excessively, or speaks, the penalty potion must be consumed. During this time, the player must answer one question from the partner truthfully. Draco looked up. Directly across from him sat Hermione Granger. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The playful atmosphere of the game night evaporated, replaced by a sudden, spiking tension that made the hair on Hermione's arms stand up. "Absolutely not," Draco said, his voice rising. "I am not staring at Granger for 2 minutes. Give me the potion. I'll drink the whole flask." "Rules are rules, Malfoy," Ginny said, though she looked a little apprehensive. "The potion will turn your skin translucent for a week. You really want to walk around Hogwarts showing off your veins?" Draco froze, his hand halfway to the purple flask. He cursed under his breath, a vicious string of words that made the candles flicker. Slowly, reluctantly, he withdrew his hand. He turned his head, his body rigid, and locked eyes with Hermione. "Get it over with," he snapped. Hermione felt her heart hammer against her ribs. This wasn't a game anymore. She straightened in her chair, setting her glass down. She met his gaze. His eyes were a storm of grey, flint and steel and rain. Up close, without the distance of the great hall or the classroom, they were overwhelming. She could see the flecks of silver near the pupil, the slight dilation as the adrenaline hit him. She saw the defensive walls slammed up high, the occlumency shields shifting like plates of armor behind his irises. "Timer starts. Now," Blaise whispered. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the rain and the rhythmic, frantic beating of Hermione's own heart. He was looking at her, not at her, but into her, and she was looking back. She saw the fine lines of strain at the corners of his eyes. She saw the way his throat moved as he swallowed. She saw the fear. It was buried deep, hidden under layers of arrogance and boredom, but it was there. He was terrified of being seen. He was terrified of being known. And she was just Hermione, mudblood, war heroine, the girl who knew everything except how to stop looking at Draco Malfoy. The seconds stretched into hours. The air between them grew hot, charged with static. It was uncomfortable, intimate, and terrifyingly raw. "The question," Ginny prompted softly from the sidelines. "Draco has to answer one question." Draco didn't break eye contact. His gaze bored into Hermione's, challenging her, daring her to ask something cruel, something that would destroy him. "Ask me about the mark. Ask me about the manor. Ask me about Dumbledore." Hermione's lips parted. She had 1,000 questions. But looking at him now, stripped of his pride, sitting in a chair with blue hair and a terrified soul, she couldn't ask the hard ones. "Why?" she started, her voice trembling slightly. She cleared her throat. "Why do you keep playing? You're losing every round. You hate it. Why didn't you leave?" Draco's eyes widened slightly. It wasn't the question he expected. The shield behind his eyes faltered, just for a fraction of a second, revealing a glimpse of profound loneliness. He didn't look away. He couldn't. "Because," he said, his voice low, a velvet scrape against the silence, "if I leave, I have nowhere else to go." The truth of it hung in the air, fragile and devastating. Hermione felt her breath hitch. The anger she had held onto for years, the righteous indignation, felt suddenly heavy and useless. She wasn't looking at an enemy anymore. She was looking at a boy who was drowning and who had stayed in a room full of people who disliked him just to feel the warmth of the fire. The timer chimed softly. Draco broke the gaze instantly, tearing his eyes away as if he had been burned. He grabbed his glass, his hand shaking violently now, and drained the dregs of the ice melt. He stared at the floor, his chest heaving slightly. Hermione sat frozen, her skin tingling where his gaze had touched her. She felt unmoored, the logic of her world tilting on its axis. The game was still going, but the rules had fundamentally changed. The silence that followed Draco's confession was heavier than the stone walls of the castle. It wasn't the empty silence of a library, but the dense, pressurized quiet of a room where a secret has just been spilled like red wine on a white carpet. Impossible to ignore, impossible to clean up, nowhere else to go. The words hung in the air, mingling with the scent of wood smoke and ozone. Hermione stared at the rim of her glass, her mind racing. She was an architect of logic. She built her world on facts, on history, on clear delineations between right and wrong. Draco Malfoy was the wrong. He was the bully, the coward, the prejudiced aristocrat. But the boy sitting across from her, clutching a tumbler of whiskey as if it were a lifeline, didn't fit the blueprint. He was jagged edges and raw nerves, a ruin of a person trying to pass himself off as a functioning structure. "Right," Ginny said, her voice unusually soft, lacking its earlier manic energy. She cleared her throat, breaking the spell. "Well, that was honest. The board accepts the answer." The board gave a low, rumbling purr of approval, the sound vibrating through the table legs. The skull card dissolved into silver mist, and the oppressive tension lifted, just a fraction. Draco didn't look up. He was staring at the ice melting in his glass, his jaw set so hard Hermione worried his teeth might crack. He looked like he wanted to vanish. "My turn," Blaise announced, perhaps a little too loudly. He reached for the dice with a practiced languor, trying to drag the atmosphere back to casual indifference. He rolled. A safe 7. He drew a card, chuckled, and downed a shot of fire whiskey without complaint. The game moved on, but the dynamic had fractured. The playful teasing was gone, replaced by a wary observation. Hermione watched Draco from beneath her lashes. He was rebuilding his walls brick by brick. She could see it happening. The straightening of the spine, the settling of the sneer, the cold glaze returning to his eyes. But she had seen behind the curtain now, and the image of his terrifying loneliness was burned into her retinas. It was Hermione's turn again. She reached for the bone dice. They felt warm in her palm, humming with faint magic. "Please," she thought, "just a simple trivia question. No performances, no truths." She threw them. A 3 and a 4, 7. A safe number. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her golden book piece moved 7 spaces forward, landing on a square painted with 2 intertwined snakes. The board didn't produce a card. Instead, the wood beneath the playing pieces rippled like water. The candles in the room flared, their flames turning a deep, rich violet. "Ah, oh," Ginny murmured, leaning over the board. "The Gemini square. I haven't seen that one in years." "What does it do?" Hermione asked, suspicion creeping back into her voice. "It demands unity," Blaise said, a slow grin spreading across his face, the first genuine amusement he'd shown in 10 minutes. "It forces 2 players to share resources. Or, in this case, space." A scroll materialized in the air above the board, unrolling with a snap. Ginny read the glowing script aloud. "The path is long, the burden heavy. To proceed, the roller must share the burden with the player who last spoke truth. They shall share a seat until the clock strikes the hour." The player who last spoke truth. Hermione's eyes snapped to Draco. Draco's head whipped up, his expression one of pure horror. No. The board is quite specific, Blaze said, pointing to the scroll. Granger rolled. Draco spoke the truth. You two are now benchmates. There isn't room, Draco spat, gesturing to the single velvet armchair he occupied. This is ridiculous. I'll stand. If you refuse, the penalty is, well, looks like the board turns you into a ferret again, Ginny said, reading the fine print. And I don't think Moody is here to bounce you around. Draco went pale. The memory was clearly a visceral one. He looked from the board to Hermione, his grey eyes wide and trapped. Hermione felt a flush rising up her neck. Share a chair with Draco Malfoy? The logistics alone were a nightmare, let alone the psychological warfare of it. But she looked at his face, the panic warring with the pride, and made a decision. It was just a game. It was just research. She stood up, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. Move over, Malfoy, she said, her voice brisk, channeling her best headgirl authority. Draco stared at her as if she had grown a second head. Granger, you can't be serious. Do you want to be a ferret? He cut himself off, teeth clicking shut. He glared at the board, then at her. With a rigid, jerky motion, he shifted to the far left of the large armchair, pressing himself against the armrest as if trying to merge with the upholstery. It was a wide chair, designed for lounging, but it was not designed for two grown teenagers who had spent the last 7 years on opposite sides of a war. Hermione approached. Every step felt like walking through molasses. She turned and lowered herself into the empty space beside him. The contact was immediate and electric. Her thigh brushed against his. The warmth of his legs seeped through the fine wool of his trousers and the denim of her jeans. A sudden, shocking heat that made her breath hitch. She sat stiffly, pulling her arms in, trying to make herself as small as possible. They were wedged together. There was no escaping it. His shoulder pressed against hers, a solid, unyielding wall of tension. She could smell him now, not just the generic scent of the room, but him. He smelled of expensive parchment, rain-soaked wool, something crisp like green apples, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. It was intoxicating, and it was terrifying. If you elbow me, Granger, I will hex you, Draco muttered, his voice strained. He was staring straight ahead, refusing to look at her, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. I have no desire to touch you, Malfoy, she whispered back, though the lie tasted like ash on her tongue. The contact was burning her, a brand of heat where their bodies met. Comfortable? Blaze asked, eyes twinkling maliciously. Shut up, Zabini, they said in unison. The game resumed, but now the stakes had shifted entirely. The board game was secondary. The real game was happening in the armchair. Every movement Draco made, Hermione felt. When he breathed, she felt the expansion of his ribcage against her arm. When he reached for his glass, she felt the shift of his muscles. It was an intimacy they hadn't earned, a forced proximity that stripped away the layers of polite distance they had carefully maintained. Hermione found herself hyper-aware of his hands. They were beautiful hands, she realized with a start. Long, slender fingers, manicured nails, a faint ink stain on his left thumb. They were the hands of a pianist or a potions master, not a soldier. She glanced up at his profile. He was painfully rigid, his jaw clenched tight. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, catching the candlelight. He was holding his breath, she realized. He was trying not to breathe, because breathing meant moving, and moving meant touching her more. He was terrified of her. The realization washed over her, cooling the indignation in her blood. He wasn't disgusted by her mudblood status. Not anymore. He was afraid of the connection. He was afraid of the human warmth she offered, because he didn't think he deserved it. "Breathe, Malfoy," she whispered, so low only he could hear. "You'll pass out." He turned his head slightly, just enough to look at her out of the corner of his eye. His grey eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide. "I am breathing," he hissed. "You're hyperventilating silently. It's a distinct skill, but not a healthy one." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. Blink, and you'd miss it. "I'm trapped in a chair with the brightest witch of her age, who also happens to have the sharpest elbows in existence. Forgive me if I'm tense." "My elbows are perfectly average." "Your elbows are lethal weapons. I still have a bruise from third year." Hermione almost laughed. It bubbled up in her throat, a hysterical, giddy sound. They were bickering. They were sitting thigh to thigh in a magical armchair, bickering about third year. It was absurd. It was normal. The storm outside hammered against the glass, a crescendo of wind and rain. A draught swept through the room, making the candles flicker wildly. Hermione shivered involuntarily. Without a word, Draco shifted. He didn't move away. He shifted his weight, blocking the draught from hitting her directly. It was a subtle movement, perhaps instinctive, but Hermione felt it. The cold air stopped hitting her shoulder, blocked by the solid warmth of his body. She looked at him, stunned. He was staring determinedly at the fireplace, his expression blank, but the tips of his ears were pink. He had shielded her. Something inside Hermione's chest, something tight and protective that she had carried since the war ended, began to unravel. "Next turn," Ginny called out, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring in the armchair. Draco had to roll. He had to lean forward to reach the dice. As he did, his arm brushed fully against hers, friction generating a spark that was almost visible. He froze for a second, then completed the motion, grabbing the dice and tossing them quickly. Snake eyes. 2 ones. The board groaned, a low, mournful sound like a dying cello. "Oh, Draco," Blaise sighed. "The universe really does have it out for you tonight." A card rose, the jester's penance. Ginny read it, wincing. "You must allow the person to your right to style your hair however they choose. The style must remain for the rest of the game." The person to his right was Hermione. Draco turned to her slowly. The blue hair from the earlier dare had faded, leaving his usual platinum locks dishevelled and slightly damp from sweat. He looked at her hands, then at her face. There was no sneer this time, just a quiet, desperate resignation. "Do your worst, Granger," he murmured. "Make me a unicorn. Put it in pigtails. I don't care anymore." Hermione looked at him. She could humiliate him. She could twist his hair into ridiculous spikes, make him look like a fool. It would be easy revenge for years of beaver tooth comments. She reached out. Her hand hovered near his face. He flinched just slightly, then held still. Her fingers brushed the hair at his temple. It was shockingly soft, like silk. She felt the pulse hammering in his temple beneath her fingertips. The heat of his skin radiated against her palm. She didn't spike it. She didn't braid it. Gently, with a touch so light it was barely there, she smoothed the hair back from his forehead. She combed her fingers through the platinum strands, tidying the mess, pushing the fringe out of his eyes. It was a gesture of care, not mockery. It was the way a mother might smooth a child's hair, or a lover might comfort a partner. The room went silent. Ginny's mouth fell open slightly. Hermione finished, her hand lingering for a fraction of a second against his cheek. "There," she said softly. "You looked a mess." Draco stared at her. His eyes were wide, unguarded, searching her face for the punchline, the trick. But there was none. She had touched him with kindness. For the first time that night, Draco Malfoy was struck completely dumb. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then turned his head away sharply toward the fire. But Hermione saw the way his hand came up, hovering near where she had touched him, as if trying to preserve the sensation. The tension in the chair shifted again. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something heavier, sweeter, and infinitely more dangerous. "Your role, Granger," Draco said, his voice rough, barely a whisper. He didn't move away. In fact, as the wind howled outside, he leaned a fraction of an inch closer until their shoulders were not just touching, but resting against each other. And Hermione didn't pull away either. The armchair was an island, and the rest of the room of requirement was a distant, blurry sea. Hermione sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white, trying to summon the entirety of her occlumency training, which, admittedly, was minimal and mostly consisted of reading a book about it in her 6th year. It wasn't working. The fortress of her mind was being besieged, not by legilimency, but by the sheer, overwhelming physical reality of Draco Malfoy. The shared space hex wasn't merely about proximity, it was about resonance. The magic of the chair seemed to act as a conduit, amplifying the person next to her until he was the only thing she could perceive. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a steady, furnace-like warmth that seeped through the layers of their clothing. It defied her expectations. She had always imagined Malfoy as cold. Cold blood, cold heart, cold manner. But here, pressed against her side from shoulder to thigh, he burned. The storm outside battered the castle walls, a low, constant roar that made the silence inside the chair feel even more profound. "Granger," Draco whispered. The sound didn't travel through the air. It vibrated directly through his shoulder into hers. "What?" she breathed back, keeping her eyes fixed on the board, where a miniature knight was currently fighting a duel with a sugar quill. "Your knee," he murmured, his voice tight. "You're bouncing it. It's distracting." Hermione froze. She hadn't realized she was doing it, a nervous tic she thought she'd conquered. She forced her leg to still. "Sorry." "Don't apologize," he snapped softly, then sighed, a jagged sound. "Just stop vibrating. I'm trying to keep my sanity intact." "I didn't think you had much left to lose after the troll ballad," she retorted, the words lacking their usual bite. They came out soft, intimate. "Low blow," he muttered, but she felt the slight shift of his muscles as he relaxed, just a fraction. Across the table, Blaise was currently arguing with the board about the definition of historical accuracy, while Ginny laughed into her wineglass. They seemed miles away. Hermione felt as though she and Draco were encased in a glass bubble, the air inside thin and charged with static. She stole a glance at him. With her hand having smoothed his hair back, his face was fully exposed to the firelight. He looked younger than he had in years. The harsh lines of war and stress were softened by the golden glow. He was staring at the fire, his eyes half-lidded, his eyelashes casting long, spidery shadows on his high cheekbones. He wasn't pulling away. That was the most unnerving part. The Draco Malfoy of the past would have been hovering on the edge of the cushion, shrinking away as if her blood were acid. But this Draco, broken, tired, stripped of his pretenses, seemed to be unconsciously leaning into her. It was as if his body, starved of touch, was betraying his mind's commands to retreat. Hermione felt a strange, terrifying urge to rest her head on his shoulder. It was an insane thought. It was illogical. It was dangerous. And yet, the gravity of him was pulling at her. Research, she reminded herself frantically. This is just data. Physical proximity induces hormonal response. It means nothing. But her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It means something. It means something. Gemini, turn, the board announced, its voice booming like a cannon blast, shattering the quiet. Hermione jumped. Draco didn't flinch, but his hand shot out and gripped the armrest, his knuckles brushing against her wrist. He didn't pull back. "Since you are joined," Ginny explained, reading a new scroll with a wicked delight. "You have to take this turn together. 2 minds, 1 move." The board rippled. The playful, colourful squares vanished, replaced by a surface of shifting grey swirling mist. A single, heavy stone tablet rose from the centre. "The riddle of the lock," the board intoned. "Answer incorrectly, and the chair shrinks." "Shrinks," Draco repeated, his voice rising an octave. "It's already a torture device. How can it shrink?" "Physics is merely a suggestion in this room, Malfoy," Blaise pointed out helpfully. "I suggest you solve the riddle." Words began to carve themselves into the stone tablet, glowing with a pale, ghostly light. Hermione leaned forward, squinting to read. Draco leaned forward too. Their heads bumped lightly. "Sorry," they muttered in unison. They didn't move apart. They stayed there, temples almost touching, reading the inscription together. The scent of him, green apples, expensive soap, and the rain filled her senses. "I have no voice, but I can tell you a story. I have no leaves, but I have a spine. I have no life, but I can die if you break me. I am the keeper of secrets, the weapon of the wise." "What am I?" Hermione's mind raced. It was easy. Too easy? "A book," she whispered. "A book," Draco whispered at the exact same second. They turned to look at each other. Their faces were inches apart. Hermione could see the specks of gold in his grey eyes, a constellation she had never been close enough to map before. She saw the surprise mirrored in his expression. "It's a book," Draco said, louder, addressing the board. "We concur," Hermione added. "Correct," the board grumbled, sounding almost disappointed. The mist cleared. The tablet sank back down. A shower of golden sparks erupted from the board, raining down harmlessly on the table. "Well done, Team Unity," Ginny cheered, clapping. But Hermione and Draco didn't look at the board. They were still looking at each other. A strange, silent communication passed between them, a recognition of shared intellect. For 7 years, they had been rivals in the classroom, constantly trying to outdo one another. But in this moment, solving the riddle in sync, the rivalry shifted into something that felt perilously like partnership. "You read too much," Draco murmured, the corner of his mouth twitching upwards. It wasn't a sneer. It was teasing? "And you don't read enough," Hermione parried, a small smile tugging at her own lips. "I'll have you know I have an extensive library, full of dark artifacts and pure-blood genealogies, I'm sure. Mostly potions, journals, and French poetry, actually." Hermione blinked. "French poetry?" Draco looked away, the pink returning to his ears. He shifted in the chair, his shoulder rubbing against hers. "Forget I said that." "No," Hermione said, her curiosity piqued. "I don't think I will." The atmosphere in the chair had changed again. The fear was evaporating, replaced by a tentative, fragile curiosity. The shared space hex was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary. For the first time all night, Hermione didn't want the game to end. She didn't want to leave this warm, cedar-scented bubble where Draco Malfoy read French poetry and smelled like rain. But the game, as always, had other plans. "Roll the dice, you lovebirds," Blaise called out. Draco stiffened. The word lovebirds hung in the air like a curse. The walls slammed back up. He pulled away from her, creating a millimeter of space that felt like a canyon. He reached for the dice, his movements jerky. He threw them with unnecessary force. A 5 and a 6. 11. His piece, the silver serpent, moved 11 spaces. It bypassed the traps, bypassed the humiliation squares, and landed on a golden square labelled the Mirror of Insight. The room dimmed. The fire in the hearth dropped low, casting long, dancing shadows. A large, oval mirror rose from the center of the board. It wasn't a normal mirror. The surface swirled like quicksilver. "The mirror shows you what your partner needs," the board whispered. "Look and understand." "Partner?" Draco asked warily. "You're in the shared chair," Ginny said, her voice hushed. "Hermione is your partner for this turn." Draco looked at the mirror. He hesitated. He looked terrified. To see what Hermione Granger needed. That was an invasion of privacy so profound it made legilimency look like a polite conversation. "You don't have to," Hermione said quickly, sensing his panic. "We can take the penalty." Draco looked at her. He looked at the purple penalty potion bubbling on the table. Then he looked back at the mirror. "I'm not drinking that filth," he muttered. He leaned forward and looked into the swirling glass. Hermione watched his face. She couldn't see the image in the mirror. Only the viewer could see it. She watched as Draco's expression shifted. First, confusion. His brow furrowed. Then, shock. His eyes widened, his lips parting slightly. And finally, a profound, softening sadness. He stared into the glass for a long time, his breathing shallow. Whatever he was seeing, it wasn't what he expected. It wasn't a book, or a grade, or a medal. Slowly, he pulled back. The mirror descended into the board. The room was silent. "Well," Blaise asked gently, "what did you see?" Draco didn't answer immediately. He turned his head slowly to look at Hermione. His gaze was different now. It was stripped of the last remnants of hostility. It was heavy with a new, burdensome knowledge. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. Not the war heroine, not the bushy-haired know-it-all, but the human being beneath. He saw her. "Peace," Draco said, his voice a rough whisper that cracked in the middle. "I saw quiet." Hermione felt the air leave her lungs. She had expected him to say something mocking, or perhaps something literal, like a new quill. But peace, quiet. It was the one thing she craved more than anything. Her mind was a constant storm of anxiety, of memories, of lists and duties and expectations. She was the golden girl who had to hold everyone else together. She was loud, she was busy, she was relentless. But inside? Inside, she was just tired. She wanted the noise to stop. How had the mirror shown him that? And more importantly, why did he look so devastated by it? Draco looked down at his hands. She needs for the noise to stop, he murmured, almost to himself. He shifted his hand on the armrest. His pinky finger brushed against hers. He didn't pull away. He let it stay there, a tiny, tentative point of contact that felt like an anchor in the storm. "I can be quiet," he whispered, so low that even Ginny couldn't hear. Hermione's vision blurred. Tears, hot and unbidden, pricked at her eyes. She blinked them away furiously, staring at the board. "Your turn, Granger," Draco said, his voice regaining a shred of its usual composure, though it lacked any heat. He stayed close. He stayed warm. And in the silence that followed, Hermione realized with a jolt of panic that was purely emotional. She was safe. Here, in the arms of the boy who had once wished her dead, trapped in a magical chair while the rain lashed against the windows. She felt safer than she had in months. The realization was a betrayal of everything she knew. It was illogical. It was impossible. And it was true. Hermione reached for the dice, her hand brushing his again. The electricity that sparked between them was no longer just static. It was a current, a connection, a promise. She rolled. The game continued, but the board lay forgotten in her mind. The real game was happening in the friction of wool against denim, in the syncopated rhythm of their breathing, and in the terrifying, wonderful silence that Draco Malfoy had just offered her. He had seen her need, and instead of using it as a weapon, he had offered himself as the solution. "I can be quiet." The words echoed in her mind, louder than the thunder outside. The enemy was gone. In his place sat a boy with French poetry in his head, and a sadness that matched her own. And for the first time, Hermione didn't want to run away. She wanted to lean in. The candle flames had burned low, casting long, wavering shadows against the stone walls of the room of requirement. The storm outside had settled into a steady, rhythmic thrumming against the glass, a wet heartbeat that seemed to encase the room in a world of its own. Inside the shared space armchair, the atmosphere was no longer just tense. It was heavy, saturated with a confusing mix of adrenaline and an exhaustion that felt dangerously like intimacy. Draco Malfoy hadn't moved his pinky finger. It still rested against Hermione's, a microscopic point of contact that felt like a lightning rod grounding a storm. He was painfully aware of the rise and fall of her chest, the scent of her shampoo, something floral and sensible, like chamomile, but with an underlying note of parchment that was entirely her own. He was drowning, he realized with a start. Drowning in the proximity of the one person he had spent a lifetime convincing himself he despised. And the worst part was, he wasn't fighting the current anymore. "Your turn, Malfoy," Blaise said, his voice cutting through the haze. He was leaning back on the sofa, watching them with eyes that held too much knowing. Draco flinched. He had forgotten the game. He had forgotten everything except the heat radiating from the girl pressed against his side. Reluctantly, he pulled his hand away to reach for the dice. The loss of contact was immediate and jarring, leaving a cold spot on his skin. He grabbed the bone cubes, shaking them in his fist. "Just let it be a movement roll," He prayed to whatever deity listened to ex-Death Eaters. Just let me move the piece and be done. He threw the dice. They clattered loudly on the wooden board, spinning violently before settling. A 4 and a 3. 7. His silver serpent piece slithered forward 7 spaces. It bypassed the safe zones. It bypassed the trapdoors. It coiled itself tightly around a square marked with a symbol Draco didn't recognize. A heart encased in crystal, cracked down the middle. The board let out a sound like a harp string snapping, sharp, dissonant, and vibrating with magic. The crystal heart, Ginny whispered, leaning forward, her eyes wide. I've never seen that one come up. A card rose from the center of the board. It wasn't parchment this time. It was a thin sheet of glass, shimmering with iridescent light. Words formed on the surface in flowing, elegant script that glowed with a soft, pulsing white light. The tongue is a shield, sarcasm a sword. Lay them down. The player must offer a tribute of truth to their partner. A compliment, unblemished by irony, shadow, or deceit. Speak what you see, or the silence will take you. Draco stared at the glass card. The words swam before his eyes. A compliment to Hermione Granger, without sarcasm. You have got to be joking, Draco said, his voice dry and brittle. I am not doing that. The silence is a nasty penalty, Draco, Blaze warned, swirling his drink. It seals your mouth shut. Literally, skin grows over it. Very Matrix glitch, very unpleasant. I'd prefer it, Draco snapped. I have nothing to say to Granger that fits those ridiculous criteria. Oh, come on, Ginny prodded, though her voice was gentle. Just one nice thing. It's Hermione. She's the easiest person in the world to compliment. Say she's smart. Say she's punctual. Anything. Draco looked at Ginny, then back at the board. The glass card was pulsing faster now. A timer. He turned his head slowly to look at Hermione. She was watching him. Her expression was guarded, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She expected him to fail. She expected him to insult her, or to take the penalty rather than acknowledge her worth. Why wouldn't she? He had spent 7 years calling her names, belittling her heritage, mocking her existence. The shame of it washed over him, hot and acrid. Smart. That was the easy answer. You're the brightest witch of your age. It was a fact, a statistic. He could say it and be done. But as he looked at her, really looked at her in the dim golden light of the room, the word smart felt woefully inadequate. It felt like describing a dragon as large, or a hurricane as windy. The board hummed, a warning note. Time was running out. Draco, Hermione whispered. It was the first time she had used his first name without a prefix of venom. It sounded strange on her tongue, soft and hesitant. Just take the penalty. I don't mind. She was giving him an out. She was sparing him the indignity of having to be kind to her. And that broke him. Something inside Draco's chest, some calcified layer of pride and prejudice that had been cracking all night, finally shattered. He didn't want the out. He didn't want to be the person who couldn't find a single good thing to say about the girl who had saved the wizarding world. He shifted in the chair, turning his body fully toward her. His knee knocked against hers. He didn't pull back. He looked at her face. He let his eyes trace the features he had spent years avoiding. He saw the stubborn set of her chin, the defiance that had withstood torture on his drawing room floor. He saw the faint, pale scar on her neck, a souvenir of a war they were both too young to have fought. He saw the scattering of freckles across the bridge of her nose, like a map of stars he had never bothered to learn. But mostly, he saw her eyes. They weren't just brown. They were amber and honey and old oak. They were warm. They were terrified. And they were looking at him with a vulnerability that stripped him bare. He realized, with a jolt that stopped his heart, that she wasn't just beautiful. She was vital. She was the most alive thing in a castle full of ghosts. The words rose up in his throat, unbidden, bypassing his brain's filters, bypassing his sarcasm, bypassing his fear. "You are," he started, his voice rough, barely a whisper. He cleared his throat. The room went deathly silent. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath. Draco's grey eyes locked with hers. He didn't blink. He couldn't. "You are the only thing in this world that is entirely real," he said softly. Hermione's breath hitched. Her eyes widened. Draco didn't stop. The dam had broken. Everything else, the politics, the blood status, the family names, it's all just smoke. It's all theatre. But you... He reached out, his hand trembling, and stopped just inches from her face, afraid to touch her, afraid to burn. "You are vivid, Granger. You are relentless. You burn so brightly that it's exhausting just to look at you, because you make everything else look grey by comparison." He paused, his voice dropping to a velvet murmur, raw and terrifyingly honest. "I have spent years hating you because you were the proof that everything I was taught was a lie. You were better. You were always better. And you were beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with fire." He stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Draco sat there, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. He felt exposed, flayed open. He had said too much. He had given her the weapon to destroy him. He waited for the laughter, for the mockery, for the rejection. But Hermione didn't laugh. She sat frozen, staring at him as if he were a stranger who had just walked through the wall. Her mouth was slightly open, her cheeks flushed a deep rose pink. Her eyes were shimmering, swimming with unshed tears that caught the candlelight. She looked, stunned. The glass card on the board chimed, a pure, crystalline sound of acceptance. It dissolved into a shower of white petals that vanished before they hit the table. Task complete. But the game didn't matter anymore. Draco couldn't look away from her. He had forced himself to see her for the dare, but now that he had seen her, he couldn't unsee her. He noticed the way a single curl fell over her eyebrow. He noticed the pulse beating rapidly at the base of her throat. He noticed the way her hands were trembling in her lap. He wanted to reach out and cover those hands with his own. The urge was a physical ache in his palms. "Draco," she breathed again. This time, the name wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement. "Don't," he whispered, looking down at his lap, unable to bear the intensity of her gaze any longer. "Don't analyze it. Don't verify it. Just take the turn." He grabbed his glass of whiskey and downed the remainder in one swallow, the burn of the alcohol doing nothing to cool the fire in his face. Hermione didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached for the dice. Her hand brushed his arm. It wasn't an accident. She let her fingers trail lightly over the wool of his sleeve, a ghost of a touch that sent a shiver straight down his spine. "Thank you," she said softly. It wasn't a polite thank you. It was heavy with meaning. Draco closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the chair. He felt the shift in the air, The enemy's dynamic was dead, killed by his own words. And in its place, something new was struggling to breathe. Something fragile, terrifying, and undeniably magnetic. He had let the light in, and God help him, he didn't want to push it back out. "Just roll, Granger," he rasped, his voice sounding wrecked even to his own ears. She rolled. The game moved on. But the shared space chair felt different now. It was no longer a cage. It was the only place in the world he wanted to be. He opened his eyes and turned his head slightly, just enough to catch her profile. She was watching the board, but a small, secret smile played on her lips. Draco felt a strange sensation in his chest, a fluttering that he hadn't felt since before the war. It was hope, and it terrified him more than the Dark Lord ever had. He sat there, in the quiet aftermath of his confession, and let the realization wash over him. He didn't just respect her. He didn't just tolerate her. He was captivated by her. And looking at the soft flush on her neck, he had the sinking, terrifying suspicion that she might not be entirely indifferent to him either. The storm raged outside, but inside the room of requirement, the air was crackling with a different kind of electricity, the kind that starts fires. The words he had spoken seemed to linger in the air like smoke, refusing to dissipate. "You are the only thing in this world that is entirely real." Draco stared at the dregs of amber liquid in his glass, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that made him feel sick. He had broken the cardinal rule of the Malfoy family: never reveal your hand, never show the soft underbelly, never let them see what matters. And yet, looking at his own reflection in the crystal tumbler, he didn't recognize the panic he expected to feel. Instead, he felt a terrifying, weightless sensation. It was the feeling of falling, or perhaps the feeling of finally stopping the exhausting effort of holding up a collapsing ceiling. Beside him, Hermione was silent. In the shared space of the armchair, her silence was not empty. It was a physical presence. He could feel the tension radiating off her, but it wasn't the jagged, defensive tension of earlier. It was a stunned, vibrating stillness. She didn't move away. That was the detail that his mind latched onto, turning it over and over like a smooth stone. After he had laid his soul bare, confessed that her very existence made his world look grey, she hadn't recoiled. She hadn't laughed. She hadn't looked at him with that pitying, poor, broken Death Eater expression he loathed above all else. She simply sat there, her shoulder pressed against his, absorbing his heat and offering her own in return. "The board is satisfied," Blaise said, breaking the silence. His voice was unusually subdued, lacking its customary mocking lilt. Even Zabini, the master of indifference, seemed to realize that the tectonic plates of the room had shifted. "Right," Ginny squeaked, clearing her throat loudly. "Right. Moving on. Who's next?" "Me," Hermione said. Her voice was steady, but quiet. She leaned forward to roll the dice. The movement caused her arm to slide against Draco's. The friction sent a jolt of electricity through him that was so sharp, so visceral, it nearly made him gasp. It wasn't just static. It was a current of awareness that seemed to bypass his brain and go straight to his blood. He watched her hand release the bone dice. He watched the way her wrist turned, the delicate protrusion of the ulnar bone, the faint blue vein tracking under her pale skin. He found himself tracing that vein with his eyes, wondering where it led, wondering if her pulse was racing as fast as his. "Stop it," he ordered himself. "You've said your piece. Don't make it worse." But he couldn't stop. The floodgates were open. The mental dam he had built to keep Hermione Granger in the category of enemy or rival or irritant had been obliterated. Now, without the filter of prejudice or bitterness, he was forced to confront the reality of her. And the reality was that she was captivating. It wasn't just her intelligence or her moral compass, though those were irritatingly perfect. It was the way she chewed her bottom lip when she was calculating the dice roll. It was the way a loose tendril of hair curled against her neck, defying her attempts to tame it, just as she defied everyone's attempts to categorize her. It was the way she smelled, like rain on dry pavement, like old books, like something sweet and alive. She smelled like home. The thought terrified him. How could she smell like home? She was the antithesis of everything he had been raised to value. She was the storm that had battered down his manor gates. And yet, sitting here in this enchanted chair, with the storm raging outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in his own house for years. The dice stopped, a safe number, no dares, no truths. Hermione sat back. She didn't retreat to her corner of the chair. She settled back into the space beside him, her arm brushing his again. "Draco," she whispered. He flinched. The sound of his name on her lips, spoken with that soft, intimate inflection, was a weapon. "Don't," he muttered, staring determinedly at the fire. "Don't ask me to explain. I can't." "I wasn't going to ask you to explain," she replied, her voice low, meant only for him. "I was going to say, I never knew." He turned his head slowly. Their faces were inches apart. The firelight danced in her eyes, turning the brown to liquid gold. "You weren't supposed to know," he said, his voice ragged. "I wasn't supposed to know." It was an admission of his own blindness. He had spent years looking at her, but refusing to see her. He had hated her because she was the anomaly in his worldview, the muggle-born who was more magical, more brilliant, more worthy than he was. To admit her worth was to admit his own obsolescence. But the war was over. The pure-blood supremacy was dead and rotting. And here he was, a prince of ashes, sitting next to the girl who had built a new world out of the rubble. "You're not who I thought you were," Hermione murmured. She was searching his face, reading the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. She was cataloguing him, analyzing him. But this time, the data wasn't being filed under threat. It was being filed under human. "I'm exactly who you thought I was," Draco corrected bitterly. "I'm just tired of pretending it's a noble role." "No," she shook her head slightly. "The Draco I thought I knew would never have said what you just said. He would have choked on the truth." "Maybe I am choking," he whispered. "Maybe this is what drowning feels like." Her gaze dropped to his lips, then back up to his eyes. The movement was subconscious, fleeing, but Draco saw it. His breath hitched. The air between them thickened, charged with a heavy magnetic pull. It was the kind of tension that precedes a lightning strike. The shared space hex was amplifying it, yes, but the source was them. It was the collision of two opposing forces, finding a sudden, violent equilibrium. He wanted to kiss her. The desire hit him with the force of a bludger. It wasn't a polite curiosity. It was a ravenous, desperate hunger. He wanted to bridge the last few inches between them. He wanted to taste the reality he had just complimented. He wanted to know if she tasted like the fire she carried inside her. He clenched his hands on the armrests, his knuckles turning white. Control, he told himself. Restraint. Do not ruin this. She pities you. She is kind. Do not mistake kindness for desire. But then she shifted. Her knee pressed firmer against his. Her breathing synced with his. She was leaning in just a fraction of a millimeter. Time! The board boomed, shattering the moment into 1,000 shards. Draco jumped, his heart nearly stopping. The hour is up, Ginny announced, though she looked almost regretful to interrupt. The shared space hex is lifted. A low hum of magic resonated from the chair. The invisible force that had been binding them together, pressing them into that intimate proximity, evaporated. The chair widened. The cushions split back into 2 distinct seats. Physical space opened up between them. The loss was immediate and devastating. Draco felt the cold air rush into the gap where her body had been. It felt like a physical blow. The warmth was gone. The scent of her faded slightly, replaced by the drafty chill of the castle. He felt suddenly exposed, adrift. The bubble had burst. Hermione sat up straight, pulling her cardigan tighter around herself. She looked flustered, blinking rapidly as if waking from a trance. She looked at the space between them, a mere 6 inches of upholstery, as if it were a canyon. Draco felt a sudden, irrational anger at the board game. He wanted the hex back. He wanted the excuse to be close to her. Without the compulsion of the magic, he had no right to be in her space. He had to retreat. That was the rule. He stood up abruptly. "I need a refill," he said, his voice harsh. He walked to the side table where the decanters stood. His legs felt unsteady. He poured himself a glass of water this time, his hands shaking so much the pitcher clinked against the crystal. He kept his back to the room, taking deep, steadying breaths. He needed to recalibrate. He needed to put the mask back on. But when he tried to summon the old sneer, the old indifference, he found nothing but a hollow ache. He couldn't go back. The mechanism was broken. "Are you all right, Malfoy?" Blay asked from the sofa. Draco turned around. He leaned against the table, the glass of water cool in his hand. He looked at the group. He looked at Hermione. She was watching him. She hadn't moved from the chair, though she looked small in it now that he was gone. Her eyes were fixed on him, filled with a complex mixture of confusion and longing? No, he was projecting. "I'm fine," Draco said. "Just the heat near the fire. It's stifling." "It was getting a bit intense over there," Ginny said with a smirk, though her eyes were kind. "You two looked like you were plotting a coup or a murder." "Perhaps a bit of both," Draco deflected, forcing a tight smile. He didn't go back to the armchair. He couldn't. If he sat next to her again, without the excuse of the hex, he would do something stupid. He would touch her hand. He would tell her more truths. He would fall apart. He pulled a wooden stool from the corner and sat near the edge of the circle, creating a safe distance. The game continued. The dice clattered. The players laughed. But the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. The center of gravity had shifted. Draco sat on his stool, nursing his water, but his attention was entirely focused across the circle. He watched Hermione. He saw the way she kept glancing at the empty space beside her in the big armchair. He saw her hand drift to the spot where his arm had rested, her fingers brushing the velvet as if searching for lingering warmth. She missed him. The realization struck him with the clarity of a bell chime. She wasn't just relieved the awkwardness was over. She felt the cold too. A dangerous hope began to unfurl in his chest, tendrils of green shooting up through the ruins of his self-loathing. He caught her eye. Across the low table, through the haze of candlelight and magic, their gazes locked. This wasn't the glare of enemies. It wasn't the forced eye contact of the dare. This was voluntary. This was a conversation without words. "I saw you," his eyes said. "I see you." "I know," her eyes replied. "I'm still here." The tension in the room ratcheted up, transforming from the frantic energy of the game into a slow, heavy, suffocating pull. It was the pull of gravity, inevitable and terrifying. Draco realized then that the game was irrelevant. The dares were irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the girl with the wild hair and the golden eyes, and the terrifying fact that for the first time in his life, Draco Malfoy didn't want to win. He wanted to surrender. He took a sip of water, watching her over the rim of the glass. The monster in his chest, the guilt, the fear, the shame, curled up and went to sleep, soothed by the memory of her warmth. In its place, something else woke up, a hunger, a need. And as Hermione tucked a curl behind her ear and offered him a shy, tentative smile that didn't reach the others, Draco knew with absolute certainty he was in deep, deep trouble. And he had absolutely no intention of climbing out. The storm outside had exhausted itself, the furious drumming against the glass fading into a rhythmic, melancholic weeping of rain. Inside the room of requirement, the atmosphere had shifted in tandem. The frenetic, crackling energy of the game had dissipated, leaving behind a heavy velvet silence that draped over the furniture like dust sheets in an abandoned house. Hermione sat in the large armchair, her body still strangely attuned to the empty space beside her. The shared space hex had vanished 20 minutes ago, yet the ghost of Draco Malfoy's warmth remained. Her skin felt sensitive, hyper-aware, as if the nerves along her right side were still reaching out for a connection that had been severed. She watched him from across the circle. He was perched on a wooden stool, his posture deceptively relaxed. He held his glass of water with long, elegant fingers, staring into the liquid as if it held the secrets of the universe. The firelight, now dying down to glowing embers, cast deep shadows across his face, carving out the sharp line of his jaw and the hollow of his throat. He looked beautiful. The thought didn't startle her this time. It settled in her chest with the heavy, undeniable weight of a stone dropping to the bottom of a lake. It was a fact, like the atomic weight of gold or the wand movement for a levitation charm. Draco Malfoy was beautiful, not just in the aristocratic porcelain way she had always begrudgingly admitted, but in a new, jagged way. He was a ruin that had been illuminated by a flare. Hermione Granger dealt in facts. She built her life on logic, on history, on the sturdy foundation of things that could be proven and categorized. But the last 2 hours had dismantled her filing system. You are the only thing in this world that is entirely real. The sentence echoed in her mind, looping relentlessly. It wasn't a line from a poem or a drunken slur. It was a confession wrung out of him by magic and desperation. And the terrifying part was that she believed him. She watched him take a sip of water. His throat moved. He lowered the glass. And then, as if feeling the weight of her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes met across the low table, over the scattered dice and the slumbering board game. It wasn't the glare of enemies. It wasn't the challenging stare of academic rivals. It was a look of profound, shared exhaustion. It was the look of two people who had survived a shipwreck and found themselves washing up on the same shore, surprised to find the other one breathing. In his grey eyes, she saw the question she was too afraid to ask herself. What now? Well, Ginny announced, stretching her arms above her head with a satisfying crack, breaking the spell. I think the board has had enough of us. It's starting to smell like ozone and burnt sugar, which usually means it's about to explode or turn us all into newts. Blay chuckled, standing up and brushing invisible dust from his trousers. A wise observation, Ginevra, and I believe I have fulfilled my quota of social interaction for the month. The game board, sensing the conclusion, began to fold itself up. The magical pieces, the silver serpent, the golden book, the miniature knights, marched back into the wooden box with tiny clicking sounds. The floating candles dimmed one by one, lowering the room into a soft twilight gloom. The night was ending. Panic flared in Hermione's chest. It was irrational, sharp, and sudden. As long as they were in this room, playing this game, the rules of the outside world didn't apply. Here, Draco could be vulnerable. Here, she could sit next to him and feel safe. But once they walked out that door, they would be back in Hogwarts, back to Gryffindor and Slytherin, back to the whispers in the corridors and the weight of their histories. She stood up, her movements jerky. She needed to pack. She needed to organize. Activity was the antidote to feeling. "I'll help clear up," she said, her voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. "Leave it, Granger." Blaise waved a hand lazily. "The room provides, the room takes away. It'll clean itself." Draco stood up then. He moved slowly, unfolding his tall frame from the stool with a grimace of stiffness. He set his glass down on the table with a soft clink. He didn't look at Blaise. He didn't look at Ginny. He looked at her. He was waiting. The realization made Hermione's breath hitch. He wasn't rushing to the door. He wasn't making a quick exit to escape the awkwardness of his earlier confession. He was standing there, his hands in his pockets, adjusting the cuff of his sweater, waiting for the group to move together. "Shall we?" Ginny asked, oblivious to the subcurrents of tension that were practically ionizing the air between Hermione and Draco. She grabbed her bag and headed for the heavy oak door. Blaise followed, offering a mock salute to the room. "Until next time, you sentient lumber." They stepped out into the corridor. Hermione hesitated. She looked around the room of requirement one last time. The fire was just aglow now. The velvet armchair where they had sat pressed together looked empty and lonely. It felt like leaving a sanctuary. "Granger." The voice came from the doorway, low, rough, impatient. She turned. Draco was standing in the open door, holding it for her. He was leaning against the frame, his body creating a silhouette against the torchlight of the corridor. "Are you coming?" he asked. "Or are you planning to move in?" "I'm coming," she murmured. She walked towards him. As she neared the door, the temperature dropped. The magical warmth of the room gave way to the drafty chill of the 7th floor corridor. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering involuntarily. Draco didn't move out of the way immediately. For a second, she had to stop right in front of him, the threshold separating the magical room from the castle. He was close. She could smell him again, that scent of green apples and rain that had become abruptly, terrifyingly addictive. He was looking down at her, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "You're shivering," he observed. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "It's cold," she replied intelligently. "Hogwarts is always cold," he said. You'd think after 1,000 years, someone would have invented a better heating charm. "Maybe it builds character," she suggested, her voice trembling slightly. "I have enough character," he drawled, his eyes dark. "I don't need any more." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was small, barely there, but it was real. It was the first genuine smile she'd seen on his face in, perhaps, ever. It changed his entire face, softening the sharp angles, lighting up the grey of his eyes. Hermione felt her heart do a traitorous double flip. He stepped back, allowing her to pass through the doorway. As she crossed the threshold, the heavy oak door swung shut behind them, vanishing back into the stone wall until nothing remained but blank masonry. They were back in the castle. The torchlight flickered on the stone walls. The portraits snored softly in their frames. Down the hall, Ginny and Blaise were already turning the corner, their laughter echoing faintly. Hermione and Draco were alone in the corridor. The silence here was different. It wasn't the warm, intimate silence of the room. It was the vast, echoing silence of the castle that had seen too much war. It was a silence that demanded they remember who they were. Hermione Granger, Draco Malfoy, oil and water. But the oil and water had shaken together, and the emulsion hadn't separated yet. They began to walk. Automatically, they fell into step beside each other. Not close enough to touch. There was a careful foot of distance between them, but close enough that she could hear the rhythm of his breathing. They walked in silence for a long time, the only sound the soft thud of her shoes and the heavier click of his boots on the stone. They passed the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy. They descended the marble staircase. Hermione's mind was racing. She should say something. She should thank him for the game. She should make a polite excuse and run to Gryffindor Tower. She should re-establish the boundaries. But she couldn't. The words wouldn't come. Every time she looked at his profile, looking straight ahead, his face composed but his eyes distant, she remembered the way he had looked in the mirror. Peace. Quiet. "You were right," she said suddenly. Her voice echoed in the empty stairwell. Draco stopped. He didn't turn to face her fully, but he angled his head. "I'm often right, Granger. You'll have to be more specific." She stopped a step above him. It put them at eye level. "About the mirror," she said, her hands clenching the strap of her bag. "About the noise. I didn't realize how loud it was until it stopped." Draco turned then. He looked up at her. The torchlight from the landing cast his face in warm relief. "It never really stops," he said softly. "The noise, the expectations, the memories, they scream." He took a step closer to the banister, closing the distance between them slightly. But tonight, for a moment, it was quiet. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Because of the game?" she asked breathlessly. He shook his head slowly. "No, not the game." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and sweet. "Because of you." Hermione felt a flush rise from her chest to her cheeks. She felt exposed, seen, and terrified. She was standing on a staircase with Draco Malfoy at 1 in the morning, discussing the noise in their heads, and she desperately wanted to reach out and touch his arm, to see if he was still real. Draco seemed to sense her impulse. His gaze dropped to her hand, resting on the banister, then back to her face. His mask slipped again, revealing a flash of raw, naked longing. He took a breath, as if to speak, as if to step forward. But then, a sound echoed from the floor below, the clanking of armor and the distinctive wheezing of Filch's cat, Mrs. Norris. The spell shattered. The castle intruded. Draco flinched, his posture snapping back into rigid lines. The vulnerability vanished behind the walls of occlumency so fast it made Hermione dizzy. He stepped back, putting distance between them again. "We should go," he said, his voice rough, stripped of the softness from moments before. "Filch is on the prowl. I can't afford another detention." "Right," Hermione stammered, stepping back as well. "Yes, of course." The moment was gone, but the echo of it remained, vibrating in the air. "Good night, Granger," Draco said. He didn't look at her. He turned on his heel and began to walk briskly down the stairs towards the dungeons, his black robes billowing behind him like a shadow. Hermione stood there, her hand still gripping the cold stone of the banister. She watched him go. She watched until he turned the corner and vanished into the darkness. "Good night, Draco," she whispered to the empty air. She didn't move immediately. She stood there in the drafty corridor, trying to categorize the feeling in her chest. It wasn't logic. It wasn't friendship. It was the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of freefall. She had gone into that room to study social interactions. She had gone in as an observer. But as she turned and began the long climb up to Gryffindor Tower, Hermione Granger knew one fact with absolute certainty. She hadn't just observed the experiment. She had become the variable, and the experiment was far from over. The image of his grey eyes, unguarded, honest, and looking at her as if she were the only real thing in the world, burned behind her eyelids. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a problem, a logical, logistical, historical disaster of a problem. And for the first time in her life, she didn't want to solve it. She wanted to feel it. The days following the Unity game night did not pass. They dragged, heavy and viscous as treacle. The castle, usually a bustle of activity and noise, seemed to have sharpened its edges. For Hermione Granger, the world had acquired a new, uncomfortable clarity. She sat in the great hall for breakfast, surrounded by the familiar cacophony of owls screeching, cutlery clattering against golden plates, and the dull roar of student gossip. It was the sound of normalcy. It was the sound of life moving on. But to Hermione, it was deafening. She stared at her untouched toast, the noise battering against her temples. "I saw quiet," Draco had said. And now, everywhere she went, she felt the absence of that quiet. She felt the absence of the shared space hex that had narrowed her world down to the scent of rain and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the boy who had been her enemy. She hadn't spoken to him since the corridor. 3 days had passed, 3 days of calculated avoidance. She had seen him, of course. It was impossible not to. In potions, he sat at his usual station, his spine rigid, chopping valerian roots with a surgical precision that bordered on aggressive. In the corridors, he walked with his gaze fixed on the middle distance, the Malfoy mask firmly back in place, cold, indifferent, impenetrable. But Hermione knew it was a lie now. She had seen the cracks. She had seen the light bleeding through. She looked up toward the Slytherin table. He was there, nursing a cup of black coffee, ignoring the boisterous conversation of Zabini and Nott beside him. He looked tired. The shadows under his eyes were back, bruised purple against his pale skin. As if feeling the weight of her gaze, he froze. His hand paused halfway to his mouth. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned his head. Across the expanse of the great hall, over the heads of Hufflepuffs discussing Quidditch and Ravenclaws, debating arithmancy, their eyes locked. It wasn't the brief, accidental glance of strangers. It was a collision. Hermione felt the breath leave her lungs. For a second, the noise of the hall faded into a dull hum. She saw the flash of vulnerability in his eyes, the question, the fear, the lingering memory of the armchair. He looked at her as if he were waiting for the verdict. Was it real, or was it just the game? Then the mask slammed down. He blinked, broke the contact, and turned back to his coffee, his jaw clenching tight. Hermione let out a shaky breath, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The logic of her world had fractured. She couldn't categorize him anymore. He wasn't Malfoy, the bully. He wasn't Death Eater, the suspect. He was just Draco. And he was alone. The library was bathed in the heavy amber light of the late afternoon sun. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the high windows, swirling in lazy, hypnotic patterns. The scent of old paper and leather was thick here, a comforting perfume that usually settled Hermione's nerves. Today, however, the library offered no sanctuary. She had been staring at the same paragraph of the Standard Book of Spells, grade 7, for 20 minutes, without comprehending a single word. Her mind kept drifting back to the room of requirement, to the heat of his arm against hers, to the way his voice had cracked when he called her real. She shoved the book away with a huff of frustration. "It's illogical," she muttered to herself, rubbing her temples. "It is a physiological response to proximity and adrenaline. It is not love." She didn't dare finish the sentence, even in her own mind. The word was too big, too dangerous. She stood up, needing to move, needing to find a book that would make sense of the chaos in her head. She wandered into the restricted section, not because she needed anything, but because it was quietest there. She turned the corner into the aisle of advanced curses and counter-curses, and stopped dead. He was there. Draco was sitting on the floor at the far end of the aisle, his back resting against the dark wood of the shelves. His long legs were stretched out before him, crossed at the ankles. A stack of books lay beside him, but he wasn't reading a textbook. He was holding a small, slim volume bound in blue velvet. He didn't hear her approach. He was completely absorbed, his lips moving silently as he read, his brow furrowed not in anger, but in concentration. Hermione took a step back, intending to leave. This was his solitude. She had no right to intrude. But the floorboard beneath her foot creaked, a high, treacherous whine in the silence. Draco's head snapped up. His hand flew to his wand pocket instinctively before he recognized her. When he saw who it was, his shoulders dropped, but the tension didn't leave his frame. He scrambled to close the blue book, sliding it under a heavy transfiguration tome as if it were contraband. "Granger," he said, his voice rough. He didn't stand up. He looked up at her from the floor, unguarded and startled. "Malfoy," she replied. Her voice was softer than she intended. She should go. She should turn around and walk away, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. "Spying on me?" he asked, attempting a sneer that fell woefully flat. It lacked the venom. It was just a reflex, a shield made of paper. "Hardly," she said, taking a hesitant step closer. "I was looking for quiet." The word hung between them, heavy with the memory of the mirror of insight. Draco flinched slightly. He looked down at his hands, which were resting on his knees. "Well, you found it. It's just me and the dust mites down here." "And the French poetry," she added, nodding toward the hidden blue book. Draco's cheeks flushed a faint pink. He looked away, staring at the spine of a book on the shelf opposite him. "I told you to forget that." "I have a photographic memory, Draco," she said, using his given name again. It felt easier this time. Less like a slip, more like a choice. "I don't forget things, especially not things that surprise me." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I imagine I'm just a series of unpleasant surprises for you." "Not unpleasant," she corrected him. She walked forward, ignoring the screaming of her logical brain that told her this was a bad idea, and sat down on the floor. She didn't sit next to him. That would be too much too soon. But she sat opposite him, leaning against the opposing bookshelf. They were facing each other in the narrow aisle, separated by a few feet of dusty floorboards and a lifetime of history. Draco watched her with wide, wary eyes. He looked like a cornered animal waiting to see if she held a curse or a treat. "Why are you here, Granger?" he asked quietly. The bravado was gone. He sounded tired. "The game is over. You don't have to pretend to tolerate me anymore." "Is that what you think I was doing?" Hermione asked, tilting her head. "Tolerating you?" "I think you're polite," he said, picking at a loose thread on his trousers. "I think you're noble. You saw a pathetic case in the room of requirement, and you played along because you're Hermione Granger and you save stray dogs. But we're back in the real world now." Hermione felt a flash of irritation. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Don't decide what I'm thinking. You're not the only one who can analyze people, Malfoy." She took a deep breath. She needed to be brave. She was a Gryffindor, wasn't she? The Sorting Hat had put her there for a reason. "You said something to me," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "During the game, you said I was the only thing that was real." Draco went rigid. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the shelf. "I was drunk on atmosphere and exhaustion. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," she interrupted. "You didn't make me uncomfortable." He opened his eyes. The grey was stormy, swirling with confusion. "Then what?" he whispered. "You made me feel seen," she admitted, the truth of it tasting sweet and terrifying on her tongue. "For 7 years, people have looked at me and seen the books, or the hand-raising, or the blood status. Even my friends, they see the solution. They see the person who fixes things." She looked down at her hands, twisting the ring on her finger. "But you saw the fire," she said softly, quoting him. "And you were right. It is exhausting. Being the fire is exhausting." She looked up. Draco was staring at her as if she had just performed magic without a wand. His expression was open, stripped of all defenses. He looked struck. "I didn't think," he faltered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't think you ever got tired." "I'm always tired," she confessed with a small, sad smile. "Especially lately." Draco shifted. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them. The air in the aisle thickened, charged with the same electricity that had filled the room of requirement. But this time, there was no magic forcing it. It was just them. "You can put it down," he said softly. "The fire, just for a bit." "And do what?" she asked. "Just be," he answered. "Read, sit in silence, ignore the world." He reached out toward the stack of books beside him. His hand hovered over the blue velvet volume, the French poetry. He hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly. It was a gesture of immense trust. He was offering her the thing he hid from everyone else. Slowly, he pushed the book across the floorboards until it rested halfway between them. "Baudelaire," he murmured. "It's dismal, melodramatic. You'd probably hate it." Hermione looked at the book. Then she looked at him. She reached out and took the book. The velvet was soft under her fingers. She didn't open it immediately. She held it like a peace offering. "I don't hate it," she said quietly. "And I don't hate you." The words hung in the golden, dust-filled air. Draco let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. His shoulders slumped, the tension draining out of him. A faint flush crept up his neck, staining his pale skin. He looked down, a small, shy smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, the same smile she had seen in the corridor. "That's..." He cleared his throat, struggling for composure. "That's a start, I suppose." "It's a variable," Hermione corrected him, a playful glint entering her eyes. "A significant shift in the data." Draco chuckled. It was a genuine sound, low and raspy. He looked up at her, and the intensity in his eyes pinned her to the spot. "You are impossible, Granger," he said, but the way he said it sounded like an endearment. "I know," she replied. They sat there in the silence of the library, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the floor. They didn't speak of the war. They didn't speak of the past. They didn't try to define what this was, this fragile, tentative thread connecting them across the aisle. Hermione opened the book of poetry. Draco watched her read, his gaze steady and warm. For the first time in a long time, the noise in Hermione's head quieted. The anxiety receded. She looked up over the top of the book. Draco was still watching her. There was a lingering moment of eye contact, soft, embarrassed, and undeniably hopeful. The enemy's trope had been closed. The book was finished. But as Hermione watched the way the sunlight caught the silver in his eyes, she knew with a fluttering certainty that a new story was just beginning. And this time, they were writing it together. "Read the third one," Draco whispered, breaking the silence but not the spell. "It's about resilience." Hermione smiled, turning the page. "Okay," she said. "I'm listening." And she was. For the first time, she was really listening.
I really love this story. It feels very special and cozy to me. I wanted to write about feeling, not just action. Draco and Hermione are perfect here because they are both tired of the war. They need peace and they find it in each other. My favorite scene is when they sit in the chair together. It is very tense but also very sweet. You can feel that they want to be close even they are scared. I like that Draco is not mean here. He is just sad and lonely. Where he tells Hermione she is real, it changes everything between them. The ending is very soft. They don't kiss yet, but it's still very romantic. Reading poetry in the library is a perfect start for them. This story feels like a warm blanket on a rainy night. It is full of hope. I hope you enjoyed listening to this.